the most powerful man on earth, took 52 days to die, and he was awake for all of it. His physicians drained pus from his infected knee 40 times a day. Pressure ulcers ate through his back until you could see bone. The smell became so overwhelming that servants tied vinegar-soaked cloths around their faces just to enter the room. And through it all, through every moment of conscious decomposition, Philip II of Spain kept signing state documents, kept making decisions, kept ruling the world's largest empire, while his body literally rotted beneath him. Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that's going to stay with you. A story about the brutal reality of power, the horror of pre-modern medicine, and what happens when the most untouchable man in the world discovers he's made of the same flesh as everyone else. If this story does what I hope it does, if it makes you think or keeps you up tonight wondering what those final days really felt like, go ahead and like the video. Subscribe if you're into these deep dives where we don't sanitize the past, and tell me in the comments where you are right now, what time it is where you're listening. I always wonder who's out there joining me for these late night history sessions. Get comfortable, maybe grab some water, turn the lights down if that helps you focus. This one's going to take a while, because tonight we're not just talking about a king who died, we're going inside that death chamber. We're reading the physician's daily reports, we're following the infection day by day, symptom by symptom, wound by wound, as it consumed the most powerful monarch in Europe. And we're asking a question nobody in 1598 wanted to answer. What does it feel like when your body decomposes while you're still conscious, while you can still think clearly enough to dictate policy, while you can still smell what's happening to you? Let's find out. In 1598, Philip II of Spain ruled an empire so vast the sun never set on it. Literally. When it was night in Madrid, it was day in Manila. When darkness fell on Mexico City, dawn was breaking in the Netherlands. His territories stretched across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, Spain, Portugal, the Spanish Netherlands, Milan, Naples, Sicily, the Philippines, named after him personally, and the Americas, vast territories stretching from California down through Mexico and Central America, across the Caribbean, down the entire western coast of South America to Chile and Argentina. The wealth flowing into Spanish coffers was staggering. The silver mines at Potosi in what's now Bolivia produced more silver than Europe had ever seen. So much silver that it changed the global economy, created inflation, shifted trade patterns, made Spain the richest nation on earth by a massive margin. Treasure fleets sailed from Veracruz and Cartagena, laden with silver bars, gold, emeralds, pearls. Pirates and rival nations attacked these fleets constantly. Most got through. The money kept flowing. Philip controlled more territory and wealth than any European monarch before him. More than Charlemagne. More than the Roman emperors at their height. When Philip signed a document, fleets sailed. When he declared war, armies mobilized across multiple continents. When he made a religious pronouncement, the Inquisition moved. He was the defender of Catholicism, the most powerful Catholic monarch, the man who'd tried to invade Protestant England with the Spanish Armada, the king who'd fought for decades to crush Calvinist rebels in the Netherlands, the monarch who saw himself as God's chosen instrument on earth. And in the summer of 1598, none of it mattered. None of the territory, none of the gold, none of the power, because his body was rotting, not after death, during life, while he could still understand what was happening, while he could still feel everything, while he could still smell the putrefaction of his own flesh. Philip's physicians documented everything. They had to. This was the king. Every symptom, every treatment, every stage of his decline. They wrote daily reports, sometimes multiple reports per day, describing the infections, the pus, the smell, the necrotic tissue, the failed treatments, everything. Those reports survived, preserved in Spanish archives, and they're horrifying, clinical, detailed, unflinching descriptions of a human being decomposing alive. Because that's what happened to Philip. He didn't die quickly, didn't slip into unconsciousness, and fade away peacefully. He remained lucid, alert, aware, for 52 days. 52 days of escalating agony as infection spread through his body, as pressure ulcers ate through his skin to expose bone, as his flesh literally liquefied and drained into basins 40 times a day. 52 days of being fully conscious while his body fell apart. This wasn't unusual for 1598. Thousands of people died from infections that year, died slowly, died in pain. What makes Philip's death notable isn't that it happened, it's that it was recorded, documented in excruciating detail. When a peasant died this way, nobody took notes, nobody preserved the details for history. When a king died this way, court physicians documented everything. So we know exactly what happened. We know how long each stage lasted. We know what the wounds looked like, what they smelled like, what came out of them. We know what Philip said, what he prayed, how he spent his final lucid moments. We have the receipts, the medical records, the eyewitness accounts from monks and servants, and Philip's own son, who watched his father decompose for almost 2 months. And what those records reveal is pure medical horror. The kind of death that makes you grateful you live in an age with antibiotics. The kind of suffering that reminds you that power means nothing when bacteria get into your bloodstream. The kind of decomposition that proves we're all just meat, just flesh that rots when the systems fail. Philip II spent his entire life controlling everything. Every document that crossed his desk, every decision made in his empire, every detail of running a global superpower. He was obsessed with control, with micromanagement, with making sure nothing happened without his direct approval. And his body taught him a lesson about the limits of control, about what happens when flesh fails and there's nothing you can do to stop it, about the brutal biological reality that no amount of paperwork, no degree of devotion, no accumulation of power can stop an infection once it takes hold. That lesson took 52 days to deliver, 52 days that started with a slightly swollen knee and ended with a corpse so decomposed they had to bury it within 24 hours because the smell was overwhelming, even after death. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because to understand how Philip died, you need to understand who he was, what shaped him, what drove him, why he made the choices he made, including the choice to design his own death chamber 35 years before he needed it. So let's start at the beginning, not at his death, at his life, because the two are inseparable. The way Philip lived determined how he died. The room he built determined where he suffered. The faith he clung to determined how he endured. Philip II wasn't just born into power, he was raised for it, trained for it, shaped by it from the moment he could understand words. His father was Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, Archduke of Austria, Duke of Burgundy, ruler of the Netherlands, King of Naples and Sicily, Lord of the Americas. Charles held so many titles, it took several minutes just to recite them all. He was the most powerful man in Europe, possibly the most powerful man in the world, and he was exhausted, completely, utterly burned out. Ruling a scattered empire from Germany to Spain to the Americas was impossible. Charles spent his entire reign travelling, fighting wars, dealing with Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, battling the Ottoman Turks, managing conflicts between his various territories. He never stopped, never rested, and it destroyed him. By the 1550s, Charles was done, worn out, sick, tired of the constant warfare and politics. So in 1556, he did something almost unprecedented. He abdicated, gave up his titles, split his empire between his brother Ferdinand and his son Philip. Ferdinand got the Holy Roman Empire and the Austrian territories. Philip got everything else: Spain, the Netherlands, Italy, the Americas, the Philippines, the treasure fleets, the global empire. All of it landed on Philip's shoulders when he was 29 years old. But Philip had been preparing for this his entire life. Charles had made sure of it. From childhood, Philip was educated by the best tutors in Europe. Latin, Greek, theology, philosophy, mathematics, military strategy, statecraft, languages. He could speak Spanish, Portuguese, Latin, and some French and Italian. He was trained to read documents critically, to spot deceptions, to understand finance and military logistics and diplomatic maneuvering. Charles also made sure Philip understood something crucial. Being king wasn't about glory, wasn't about tournaments and feasts and romantic adventures. It was about work, endless, grinding, detail-oriented work. Reading reports, making decisions, managing people, solving problems, day after day, year after year, until you died or abdicated from exhaustion. Philip absorbed this lesson completely, maybe too completely, because he took it to an extreme even his father hadn't reached. Philip became convinced that he personally had to oversee everything. That delegation was dangerous, that if he didn't read every document and approve every decision himself, the empire would collapse. This wasn't arrogance. This was how Philip understood his duty. God had chosen him to rule. That meant he was accountable to God for every decision made in his name. Every military campaign, every execution, every peso spent, everything. So he had to know everything, had to control everything, had to make sure everything was done right. His advisors called him the Paper King, not as an insult, just as an observation. Philip spent more time with documents than with people, more time at his desk than at court, more time reading reports from Peru and Manila and Brussels than attending state dinners or tournaments. He would read for 12, 14, 16 hours a day, taking notes, writing comments, asking questions, making corrections. He was a perfectionist, obsessive. There's a famous story about Philip spending 3 days deliberating over the colour of vestments for a chapel. 3 days for vestment colour. His advisors were tearing their hair out. The empire needed decisions on military campaigns, on trade policy, on diplomatic relations. And Philip was debating liturgical fabric colours. But to Philip, it all mattered. All of it. The vestments and the military campaigns, the chapel decorations and the treasure fleet schedules. Because all of it was part of God's plan. All of it reflected on Spain's role as the defender of Catholicism. All of it was his responsibility. This worldview shaped everything Philip did, including how he built his palace, how he structured his household, how he prepared for death. Because Philip didn't separate the sacred from the political, didn't see ruling and praying as different activities. To him, they were the same thing. Ruling was praying, praying was ruling, both were service to God. And this complete fusion of political power and religious devotion, it's what made Philip's death so particularly horrific, because he faced it as both a king and a penitent, as both the most powerful man in Europe and a sinner awaiting judgment, as both someone who expected his orders to be obeyed and someone who understood he had no control over what his body was doing. That tension between power and helplessness, between control and surrender, between earthly authority and divine judgment, that's what defined Philip's final 52 days. That's what made his suffering so psychologically complex. He wasn't just dying. He was dying while trying to maintain two contradictory identities: the king who controlled everything, and the mortal who controlled nothing. But before we get to that death, we need to understand Philip's life, his marriages, his children, his losses. Because Philip didn't just rule an empire, he was a husband, a father, a widower 4 times over, a man who'd buried most of his children, a human being who'd experienced profound personal tragedy alongside his political triumphs. And those tragedies, they shaped how he faced death, how he understood suffering, how he interpreted what was happening to his body in those final horrific days. Philip married 4 times. Each marriage was political, strategic, designed to secure alliances or strengthened claims to territory. But Philip wasn't a cold, calculating dynast. He seems to have genuinely cared for his wives, mourned them when they died. And they all died. All four, 3 of them young. His first wife was Maria Manuela of Portugal. His first cousin, actually. They married in 1543 when Philip was 16 and she was 15. The marriage was meant to strengthen ties between Spain and Portugal, unite the Iberian Peninsula. It was a good match politically, and apparently not unhappy personally. But Maria died in 1545, just 2 years after the wedding. She was 17 years old, she'd given birth to a son, Don Carlos, and then died 4 days later from complications of childbirth. Philip was a widower at 18, with an infant son. His father Charles immediately began looking for another bride, another alliance. Because that's how these things worked. Marriages were tools. If one wife died, you found another one. Philip's second marriage was to Mary Tudor. Yes, that Mary Tudor, Mary I of England, Bloody Mary, the Catholic queen who'd taken the English throne after her Protestant half-brother Edward VI died. Mary was desperate to secure Catholic succession, desperate for a Catholic heir, and desperate for a powerful Catholic ally. Philip fits all 3 needs. They married in 1554. Philip was 27, Mary was 38, 11 years older, past what was considered prime childbearing age for the era, but she was Queen of England. That made the marriage worth it for Philip and for Spain. If Mary had a Catholic heir, England would stay Catholic. The Protestant threat would collapse. Spain would have its greatest rival as an ally instead of an enemy. The marriage was a disaster, not because they fought, but because Mary couldn't have children. She had 2 false pregnancies, phantom pregnancies where her belly swelled and she was convinced she was carrying a child. Both times, nothing happened. No baby came, just the humiliating realization that she'd been wrong, that her body had betrayed her. Philip spent very little time in England. He had an empire to run. He couldn't stay in London waiting for a baby that wasn't coming. So he left, went back to Spain, visited occasionally, performed his marital duties when he was there, but mostly governed from abroad. Mary died in 1558, childless, and the English throne passed to her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth. Everything Mary had fought for, Catholic restoration, alliance with Spain, Catholic succession, gone. Philip was a widower again at 31. He'd spent 4 years married to a woman who couldn't give him children. 4 years of strategic marriage that produced nothing. And now he needed a new wife, again. His third marriage was to Elizabeth of Valois, a French princess, daughter of Henry II of France and Catherine de' Medici. This marriage was part of the Peace of Cateau Cambrésis, ending decades of war between Spain and France. Elizabeth was 14 years old when they married in 1559. Philip was 32. This marriage seems to have been genuinely affectionate, maybe even happy, as much as royal marriages could be happy. Elizabeth was young, yes, but she was intelligent, charming, good at court politics. She gave Philip 2 daughters, Isabella Clara Eugenia, born in 1566, and Catalina Michaela, born in 1567. Philip doted on these daughters, especially Isabella. She was intelligent like her mother, interested in politics. Philip trusted her in ways he didn't trust many people. But Elizabeth died in 1568. She was only 23 years old, died after a miscarriage, another pregnancy gone wrong, another wife dead from the brutal realities of 16th century childbirth. Philip mourned her deeply, sincerely. He'd lost 2 daughters as well, 2 infant daughters who died shortly after birth, and now his wife. He was a widower for the 3rd time, at 41 years old, and here's where Philip's life takes a darker turn. Because in 1568, the same year Elizabeth died, Philip's son Don Carlos also died, in mysterious circumstances. Circumstances that have fueled conspiracy theories for 450 years. Don Carlos was Philip's only surviving son from his first marriage. the heir to the Spanish throne. And he was trouble, unstable, possibly mentally ill, violent, erratic. There are accounts of him torturing animals, attacking servants, threatening to kill people, including his father. He was 23 years old in 1568, and Philip had him arrested, confined to his chambers, held under guard. The official story is that Don Carlos died of natural causes: fever, illness. He'd been refusing food, making himself sick, weakening himself deliberately, and he died. The unofficial story, whispered then, repeated now, is that Philip had him killed, or allowed him to die through neglect, because Don Carlos was becoming too dangerous, too unstable to be the heir, too much of a threat. We'll never know the truth. The evidence is contradictory. The accounts are politically charged. But what matters for our story is this: Philip lost his heir and his wife in the same year. 1568 was catastrophic for him personally. Two profound losses within months of each other. And he still had an empire to run, still had wars to fight, still had daily decisions to make about territories from Mexico to Manila. He needed a new wife, needed new heirs, needed to secure succession. Because if Philip died without a male heir, the empire would fracture. Rival claimants would emerge. Civil war was possible. Everything he'd worked for would collapse. So in 1570, Philip married for the fourth time. His bride was Anna of Austria, his niece, his sister's daughter. Yes, his niece. Marrying within the family wasn't unusual for European royalty. It kept power concentrated, kept wealth from dispersing, but it also led to genetic problems, inherited conditions, the kind of inbreeding that would eventually destroy the Spanish Habsburg line entirely. Anna was 20 years old when she married Philip. He was 43. She gave him 5 children over the next 10 years. Ferdinand, born 1571, died 1578. Carlos Lorenzo, born 1573, died 1575. Diego, born 1575, died 1582. Philip III, born 1578, survived. Maria, born 1580, survived but died at age 16. Out of 8 children total from all his marriages, only 3 survived to adulthood. Philip III, Isabella Clara Eugenia, and Catalina Michaela. That was it. 5 dead in infancy or childhood, 1 possibly murdered in his 20s, 2 dead wives from childbirth complications, 1 dead wife from a false pregnancy's aftermath. This was Philip's personal life. Loss after loss after loss. Children dying, wives dying, heirs dying, all while running an empire, all while fighting wars on multiple continents, all while reading documents for 16 hours a day and making every decision, personally, and through all of it, Philip remained devout. Believed this was God's will, that suffering was part of the divine plan, that his duty was to endure, to accept, to continue serving, no matter what. This is important for understanding how Philip faced his death, because he'd already spent decades facing suffering, facing loss, accepting things he couldn't control. He'd buried 2 infant daughters, buried 3 wives, possibly ordered the death of his first son, watched 3 more sons die in childhood. Out of 8 children, only 3 survived, and one of those, his heir, Philip III, was adequate at best, not brilliant, not driven, just competent enough. So when Philip's body started to fail in 1598, he didn't rage against it, didn't question why this was happening. He accepted it as another form of suffering, another test, another part of God's plan that he had to endure with faith and patience, even when that suffering lasted 52 days, even when his body rotted while he was still conscious, even when the pain became unbearable. Philip accepted it, because accepting suffering was what he'd been doing his entire life. But acceptance doesn't mean the pain hurt less, doesn't mean the horror was any less horrific. It just meant Philip faced it differently than someone who hadn't spent decades preparing for this moment might have faced it. He faced it like a king who'd built his own death chamber, a man who'd planned where he wanted to die and made sure he died there, a ruler who kept signing documents even when his hand was shaking from pain and infection. A Catholic who kept his eyes on the consecrated host, even when those eyes were clouded with jaundice and agony. Philip II didn't just die. He performed death, staged it, controlled it as much as anyone can control their own decomposition. And that performance, that insistence on dying the way he'd planned even when his body was betraying him in the most grotesque way possible, that's what makes his death so fascinating, so horrible, so unforgettable. But we're not there yet. We're still in the 1570s and 1580s, still watching Philip build the palace where he'll eventually die, still seeing him construct the room, position the bed, design the window that will be his view for the final 52 days of his life. So let's talk about El Escorial, because you can't understand Philip's death without understanding this place, this monastery palace mausoleum complex that Philip spent decades building, this physical manifestation of his worldview, this monument to his belief that ruling and praying were inseparable. In 1557, Spanish forces defeated the French at the Battle of St. Quentin. It was a major victory, a turning point in the Italian wars, and it happened on August 10th, the feast day of St. Lawrence. Philip, deeply superstitious and deeply devout, interpreted this as divine favour. St. Lawrence had blessed Spanish arms, had granted them victory, so Philip vowed to build a monastery dedicated to St. Lawrence, a monument to thank God for the victory. But Philip being Philip, he didn't just build a monastery, he built El Escorial, a massive complex that would serve as monastery, royal palace, basilica, library, school and mausoleum. All in one, it would be the administrative centre of the Spanish Empire, the spiritual heart of Spanish Catholicism, and Philip's own residence, everything under one roof. He chose the location personally. San Lorenzo de El Escorial, about 30 miles northwest of Madrid, in the foothills of the Sierra de Guadarrama mountains, remote enough to be peaceful, close enough to the capital to maintain control, high enough that the air was cool and clean, with views of the surrounding landscape that were both beautiful and strategically useful. You could see anyone approaching from miles away. Construction began in 1563. Philip hired Juan Bautista de Toledo as the architect. Juan Bautista had worked on St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. He understood how to build on a massive scale, how to create spaces that inspired awe, how to make stone speak about power and faith. He designed El Escorial in what's called the Herrerian style, after his successor Juan de Herrera. Simple, austere, geometric, no unnecessary decoration, clean lines, perfect proportions, a building that looked like it was built to last forever. The complex took 21 years to complete. Philip oversaw every detail, every measurement, every architectural choice. He reviewed the plans constantly, made corrections, insisted on changes. This wasn't just a building project. This was Philip's vision made physical. His understanding of what Christian monarchy should look like. Power and piety, control and devotion, all expressed in granite and marble. The finished complex was enormous. 200,000 square feet, 15 cloisters, 16 courtyards, 86 staircases, 1,200 doors, thousands of windows. At its heart was the basilica, a church so large it could hold thousands of people. The dome was 92 meters high. The facade was imposing, severe, beautiful in its austerity. The floor plan of the entire complex was designed to resemble a gridiron, the instrument of St. Lawrence's martyrdom. Lawrence had been roasted alive on a gridiron in Rome in 258 AD. He was one of the 7 deacons of Rome. When the Roman prefect demanded he turn over the church's treasures, Lawrence presented the poor and sick of Rome and said, "These are the treasures of the church." So they killed him, slowly, on a gridiron over hot coals. Legend says he remained cheerful throughout. He even joked about being turned over so he'd cook evenly. Philip loved this story, saw Lawrence as the perfect martyr, joyful in suffering, faithful unto death. So he built El Escorial in the shape of the instrument that had killed Lawrence. The entire complex, every courtyard, every cloister, every corridor, formed a massive gridiron when viewed from above. It was architectural devotion. Stone shaped into prayer, surrounding the basilica was the monastery. Hieronymite monks lived there. Their primary duty was prayer, perpetual prayer for the Spanish royal family. They celebrated Mass multiple times daily, prayed the hours, chanted hymns, filled the complex with the sound of liturgy. Philip wanted to be surrounded by prayer, to hear it constantly, to know that even when he slept, monks were praying for his soul. The library at El Escorial was one of the finest in Europe. Philip filled it with books, manuscripts, maps, scientific instruments. He collected texts from across the empire, bought entire libraries when they became available, commissioned translations of important works. The library held over 40,000 volumes by the time Philip died, including many rare Islamic and Jewish texts from the conquered territories of Spain. Philip preserved them even as the Inquisition burned other books. Because knowledge was valuable, even knowledge from other faiths, Philip also included a royal pantheon, a crypt beneath the basilica where Spanish monarchs would be buried. This wasn't finished in Philip's lifetime. The final royal pantheon wasn't completed until 1654, but Philip planned for it, designed it, made sure there would be a permanent resting place for Spanish kings and queens, a place where they would lie beneath the altar, beneath the Mass, forever surrounded by prayer. And in the royal apartments, Philip's own living quarters, he designed his bedroom with that window, that small opening that looked directly into the basilica, directly at the high altar, at the tabernacle where the consecrated host was kept. From his bed, Philip could participate in Mass without leaving his room, could see the elevation of the host, could receive communion without walking to the church. He built this feature in 1563, 35 years before he died, when he was young, healthy, at the height of his power, but already thinking about death, already planning where he wanted to be when it happened, already designing the exact view he wanted to see with his dying eyes. This is Philip's worldview in architecture, control extending even to death, planning so thorough it included his deathbed view, faith so central that his bedroom opened onto a church, power and piety so intertwined you couldn't separate them. El Escorial was both a palace and a monastery, both a seat of government and a place of worship, both Philip's office and his chapel. He ruled from there, prayed from there, lived from there, and in 1598 he would die there. In that room he'd designed, in that bed he'd positioned, looking through that window at that altar, exactly as planned, just not how he'd imagined. Philip spent his final years at El Escorial. By the 1590s he rarely left. The palace monastery had everything he needed: his desk, his documents, his chapel, his monks, his library. He could run the entire empire from this complex without ever stepping outside. And increasingly, he couldn't step outside. His body was failing. Gout had plagued him since middle age. By his 60s, it was severe, constant. His feet would swell until he couldn't walk. His hands would become so inflamed he couldn't hold a pen. The pain was excruciating, like hot needles stabbing into his joints, like glass grinding between the bones. Some days he couldn't get out of bed, couldn't stand the weight of blankets on his feet, couldn't tolerate anyone touching the affected joints. Gout is caused by uric acid crystals forming in the joints. In Philip's time, they didn't understand this. They thought it was an imbalance of humours, too much hot, moist humour accumulating in the extremities. Treatment focused on cooling and drying. Herbal poultices, restricted diet, bloodletting. None of it worked, because they didn't understand the actual cause. Modern doctors looking at Philip's medical history think his gout was likely caused by a combination of factors. Rich, diet heavy, in meat, wine consumption, but also possible kidney disease, something about his kidney's ability to process uric acid. The gout was just a symptom of broader metabolic dysfunction. His body was struggling to filter waste, and it had been struggling for years. Philip also suffered from recurring fevers, tertian fever in the medical records, fevers that came in cycles. Every few days he'd spike a high fever, chills, sweating, weakness. Then it would break. He'd recover, function normally for a while, then the fever would return. This pattern suggests malaria, or possibly some other parasitic infection, something his immune system could suppress but never eliminate. The parasite living in his blood, reproducing on a regular cycle, causing fever when its population peaked. His eyesight was deteriorating. By his late 60s, Philip needed spectacles to read, rare and expensive in the 1590s, made from carefully ground glass lenses set in metal frames. Even with glasses, reading was difficult, exhausting. His eyes would ache after a few hours, but he kept reading, kept reviewing documents, kept making notes and corrections, because that was his job, his duty, his entire identity. His digestion was wrecked. Years of rich food, years of stress, years of sitting for hours without exercise. He suffered from what they called melancholy, probably chronic indigestion, maybe ulcers, possibly some form of inflammatory bowel condition. He couldn't eat much without discomfort. His appetite was poor. He was losing weight, getting thinner, more fragile. By 1598, Philip was 71 years old, ancient for the time. Most men didn't live past 50. Kings often died younger. Battle, assassination, disease, the stress of ruling. But Philip had survived. He'd outlived his father by 14 years, outlived most of his children, outlived all 4 wives. He was still working, still signing documents, still running the empire, but barely. His body was a collection of chronic conditions barely held in check. The gout, the fevers, the failing vision, the digestive problems. Any one of them could turn acute, turn deadly. At 71 in 1598, Philip was living on borrowed time. Everyone knew it, including Philip. So he prepared, spiritually, administratively, personally. He wrote detailed instructions for his son, advice on how to govern, who to trust, who to watch, what to prioritize. He wasn't teaching Philip III to rule like he'd ruled. That would be impossible. His son didn't have the obsessive need for control, didn't have the capacity for 16-hour workdays, didn't have the faith that every decision required personal oversight. Philip knew this, accepted it. So his advice was practical. Rely on good advisors, trust the bureaucracy, maintain the faith, defend Catholic orthodoxy. Those were the core responsibilities. Everything else could be delegated. Philip III wouldn't be the paper king, but maybe he didn't need to be. Maybe the systems Philip had built, the councils, the bureaucracy, the administrative machinery, maybe those systems could function without a micromanaging monarch. Philip also prepared spiritually. Confession became more frequent, daily, sometimes multiple times per day. He wanted his soul clean, ready. He knew death was coming, knew it could come suddenly. Heart attack, stroke, fever, or slowly, gradual decline, organ failure. Either way, he wanted to be ready. He prayed more, spent hours in his private chapel, attended Mass daily, sometimes multiple Masses, took communion regularly, read devotional texts, contemplated his sins, his failures, the people who died because of his decisions, the wars he'd waged, the executions he'd ordered, the Inquisition's burnings, all of it, weighing on his conscience, all of it needing confession, needing absolution. Philip believed he'd ruled justly, that his wars were defensive, that his executions were necessary, that the Inquisition protected the faith. But he also believed he'd be judged, that God would examine every decision, every action, every consequence. And Philip wanted to be able to explain himself, to justify his choices, to show that he'd acted from duty, not ambition, from faith, not cruelty. This spiritual preparation became more intense in 1598. Philip could feel his body failing, could sense death approaching, so he doubled down. More confession, more prayer, more reading of sacred texts, more contemplation of the afterlife. He was getting ready, making sure his soul was as prepared as his successor, as prepared as the empire. And in June 1598, that preparation became urgent, because Philip's knee started to swell, started to hurt, started what would become 52 days of conscious decomposition. 52 days that would test every ounce of his faith, every bit of his endurance, every aspect of his belief that suffering had meaning. But Philip didn't know that yet. In early June, it was just a sore knee, nothing serious. Just another symptom of old age. Just another item on the long list of physical complaints he dealt with daily. He kept working, kept praying, kept preparing, not knowing that the preparation time was over, that the test had begun, that his body was about to teach him the final lesson about power and control and what it means to be mortal. The infection started so quietly you could miss it. A bit of swelling in Philip's right knee, some warmth, some stiffness. Philip mentioned it to his physicians during their routine visit. They examined it, pressed on the joint, asked about the pain. Philip said it hurt when he walked, a dull, throbbing ache, but not unbearable, nothing he couldn't manage. The physicians conferred, concluded it was gout. Made perfect sense. Philip had suffered from gout for decades. This looked like another flare-up. Same joint, same symptoms, nothing unusual, nothing alarming. They prescribed the standard treatments: rest, elevation, cooling poultices, maybe some bloodletting to reduce the heat in the affected area. This was standard 16th century medicine, based on the theory of humours. The body contained 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant keeping these balanced. Illness meant one humour was excessive. Treatment meant restoring balance. For joint inflammation, the problem was excess hot, moist humour. Solution: cool and dry the area. Draw out the excess moisture. Reduce the heat. They applied poultices, mixtures of herbs and oils wrapped in linen and tied around Philip's knee. The ingredients varied. Sometimes cooling herbs like mint, sometimes astringent substances meant to draw out moisture, sometimes things we'd recognise as having some anti-inflammatory properties, sometimes pure superstition, eye of newt territory, not literally, but herbs chosen more for symbolic meaning than therapeutic effect. They also bled him, opened a vein in his arm and drained blood into a basin. The theory was that reducing blood volume would reduce the pressure and heat in the inflamed joint. It didn't work, obviously. Bloodletting never worked for infection. If anything, it made things worse, weakened the immune system, reduced the body's ability to fight off bacteria. But 16th century physicians didn't know about immune systems, didn't know about bacteria, just knew that bloodletting was standard treatment for inflammation. Philip followed these treatments, stayed off his feet as much as possible, kept his leg elevated, let them change the poultices multiple times daily, let them bleed him. He trusted his physicians. They were the best in Spain, trained at the finest universities, versed in the writings of Galen and Avicenna and the other ancient medical authorities. If anyone could help him, they could. But they couldn't. Because it wasn't gout. It was infection. Bacteria had entered Philip's knee joint, probably through a tiny wound he didn't even notice. A scrape, a puncture, something minor that broke the skin and allowed bacteria to enter. Once inside the joint capsule, the bacteria found paradise, warm, moist, full of nutrients from the synovial fluid that lubricates joints. Perfect conditions for bacterial growth. The bacteria multiplied, rapidly, exponentially, millions becoming billions, becoming trillions, feeding on the joint fluid, producing toxins as metabolic waste, Those toxins damaged the surrounding tissue, triggered Philip's immune response. His body sent white blood cells to fight the infection. Those cells released inflammatory chemicals, caused swelling, heat, pain, the joint filled with fluid, with pus, with the debris of battle between Philip's immune system and the invading bacteria. And the poultices the physicians applied? Not sterile, made from ingredients that hadn't been boiled or properly cleaned, probably contained bacteria themselves. So while the doctors thought they were drawing out infection, they were actually introducing more, making the problem worse, giving the bacteria more opportunities to spread. The bloodletting weakened Philip's immune response, made him more susceptible, less able to fight off the infection. His body was already struggling, already fighting bacteria in his knee, and then the doctors removed blood, removed the white blood cells, removed the immune factors that were trying to control the infection. Every treatment made things worse, but the physicians had no way of knowing. They were following best practices, using techniques that had been standard for centuries, doing everything their training taught them to do. They just didn't know about bacteria, didn't know about antisepsis, didn't know that their treatments were actively harmful. By mid-June, the swelling had increased. Philip's knee was noticeably larger now. The skin stretched and shiny, hot to the touch. The pain was worse, constant, throbbing. Philip couldn't sleep well. The pain would wake him. He'd lie in bed, knee throbbing, waiting for dawn, waiting to call his physicians, waiting for some relief that never came. He tried to keep working, kept having documents brought to his bedroom. He'd read them in bed, make notes, dictate responses, but it was getting harder. The pain was distracting. His concentration was affected. He'd have to reread paragraphs, have secretaries repeat information. He was slowing down, but still trying, still refusing to stop, because stopping meant admitting he couldn't do this anymore. And Philip wasn't ready for that admission. His physicians grew more concerned. This wasn't behaving like normal gout. It should have responded to treatment by now, should have improved. Instead, it was getting worse. They consulted, debated, considered more aggressive interventions, stronger poultices, more frequent bleeding, different herbs, but nothing changed their fundamental approach because they didn't have a different approach. Humoral theory was all they had, and humoral theory didn't work for bacterial infection. By late June, the knee started draining, not deliberately. The pressure inside the joint was so great that fluid began seeping out. Through the pores, through tiny cracks in the skin stretched tight over the swollen joint. Clear fluid at first, then tinged yellow, then definitely pus, thick, yellow-white, with a distinctive smell. Not overpowering yet, but present. The smell of infection, the smell of tissue breaking down. The physicians examined this drainage. In their worldview, this was actually good. Laudable pus, the body expelling bad humours, the infection purging itself. They encouraged it, began lancing the knee to help the drainage, puncturing the swollen tissue to let the pus flow more freely. They did this carefully, reverently. This was the king's body, but they did it multiple times a day, lancing, draining, cleaning, bandaging, and watching as the knee swelled again within hours. The pus kept coming, more each day. The physicians would drain a cup, then another, then 2 cups. Where was it all coming from? From Philip's body, from the infection consuming the joint. The bacteria were multiplying so fast, producing so much waste, killing so much tissue that the body couldn't keep up, couldn't clear it fast enough. So it accumulated, built up pressure, drained whenever it could, and the bacteria were spreading. Beyond the knee now, into the surrounding tissue, into Philip's thigh, into his calf, following blood vessels, following lymph channels, setting up new colonies, new infection sites. The swelling spread. Philip's entire right leg began to swell, to turn red, to feel hot. The infection was winning, and there was nothing 16th century medicine could do to stop it. By early July, Philip couldn't walk, couldn't put any weight on his right leg. The pain was too intense, and the leg wouldn't support him. The muscles were affected by the infection, the connective tissue damaged, the joint structurally compromised. He tried once, with assistance, servants supporting him on both sides. But the moment he put weight on the leg, he screamed, collapsed, had to be carried back to bed. That was the moment Philip realised this wasn't normal gout. This was something worse, something more serious. He'd dealt with gout for decades. This felt different, and his physician's expressions told him everything. They were worried, really worried. This wasn't responding to treatment, and they didn't know why. Philip made a decision. He ordered his household to prepare to move him to El Escorial, to that room he'd designed 35 years ago, to the bedroom with the window facing the basilica, because Philip knew what his physicians wouldn't say. This infection might kill him, and if he was going to die, he wanted to die where he'd planned, in that bed. Looking through that window, eyes on the altar. The move took days to organise. Philip was too sick to travel immediately. They had to stabilise him, get the pain under control enough that he could tolerate the journey. They gave him stronger medicines, opium probably, diluted in wine. It helped a little, took the edge off, made him drowsy and confused, but reduced the pain to manageable levels. In mid-July they moved him, carefully, reverently, on a litter carried by servants, Philip lying on cushions, trying not to move his leg, trying not to scream every time the litter swayed. The journey from Madrid to El Escorial normally took a few hours by carriage. For Philip, it took all day. They stopped constantly, let him rest, let the pain subside, let him drink water and wine, let him close his eyes and pray for strength. By the time they arrived at El Escorial, Philip was barely conscious, pale, sweating despite the cool mountain air, feverish. His leg was massively swollen now, twice its normal size, red and purple, mottled with burst blood vessels, and draining constantly. Pus soaking through the bandages, staining the litter, leaving a trail. They carried him to his bedroom, the room he'd designed, placed him in his bed, positioned him carefully so he could see through the window to the basilica, to the altar, to the tabernacle. Philip opened his eyes, saw the familiar view, the view he'd planned for 35 years, and closed his eyes again, whispered something, a prayer, a thanks, a resignation. The monks in the basilica began celebrating Mass, continuous Mass, around the clock, different monks taking shifts, praying for the king, praying for his recovery, but also praying for his soul, just in case. Because everyone looking at Philip, seeing his colour, his fever, his pain, everyone knew. Recovery wasn't likely. This was probably the end. The infection had taken hold, and it wasn't letting go. Philip's physicians set up shop in the adjoining rooms, brought their instruments, their medicines, their basins and bandages, prepared to fight for the king's life, to try everything they knew, everything their training had taught them. They were the best physicians in Europe. They wouldn't give up, wouldn't stop trying, even when the infection spread, even when the wounds multiplied, even when it became obvious that nothing was working. Because in July 1598, there was no cure for what Philip had, no treatment that could save him. Antibiotics wouldn't exist for another 350 years. Antiseptic surgery wouldn't be developed for another 250 years. Basic germ theory wouldn't be understood for another 250 years. Philip was dying from something 16th century medicine couldn't comprehend, couldn't diagnose correctly, couldn't treat effectively. All they could do was drain the pus, manage the pain, keep him comfortable, and pray. Pray that God would intervene, that a miracle would happen, that the infection would resolve on its own, that Philip's body would somehow rally and fight off the bacteria overwhelming it. But miracles are rare, and Philip's body wasn't rallying. It was failing, system by system, organ by organ, day by day. the infection was spreading, and taking Philip with it. He had 40 days left, 40 days of conscious suffering, 40 days that would test every aspect of his faith, 40 days that would make witnesses question everything they believed about power and mortality and God's mercy, 40 days that started with a draining knee and would end with a rotting corpse, but we're only just beginning. Because the knee infection was just the opening act. The real horror was about to start. The pressure ulcers, the systemic sepsis, the complete breakdown of Philip's body, while his mind stayed alert, while he could feel everything, while he understood exactly what was happening to him. That horror took weeks to unfold, weeks that are documented in excruciating detail, weeks we're going to walk through. Day by day, symptom by symptom, because understanding how Philip died means understanding the slow cascade of failure that happens when infection takes over a human body. And in 1598, that cascade was unstoppable. Philip had been in bed at El Escorial for about 2 weeks when the first pressure ulcer appeared. It was late July, the height of summer, hot even in the mountains. Philip's bedroom had windows open, but the air was still, heavy. The smell of infection already permeating everything. Philip couldn't move much. The knee infection made any leg movement agony, so he lay still, on his back mostly, sometimes shifted slightly to his side with help, but essentially immobile, lying in the same position for hours, for days, and that immobility was killing him just as surely as the infection. When a human body stays in one position too long, physics becomes deadly. Philip's weight pressed down on the mattress. That pressure compressed the tissue between his bones and the bed, compressed it so much that blood couldn't flow through. And without blood flow, tissue dies. It's called pressure necrosis. The tissue literally dies from lack of oxygen. It starts on the surface, the skin. Redness appears. The servants probably noticed it first during one of the many times they changed Philip's position or changed his bandages. A red patch on his lower back, right at the base of his spine, where his sacrum pressed against the mattress. They probably mentioned it to the physicians, probably tried to cushion that area better, put pillows underneath, relieved the pressure, but moving Philip was torture. The knee made every movement unbearable. He would cry out, beg them to stop, so they didn't move him as often as they should have, didn't shift his weight frequently enough, and that red patch progressed. Redness became a blister, the skin separating from the tissue underneath, filling with fluid. The physicians probably drained it, thinking they were helping, but underneath the damage was already done. The tissue was dying, and draining the blister didn't stop that process. The blister broke open, became a shallow wound, the size of a coin at first. The physicians treated it, applied ointments, honey sometimes. Honey actually has some antibacterial properties, but also sometimes herbs in oil, or wine, or substances that did nothing except maybe introduce more bacteria. They bandaged the wound, changed the dressing daily, tried to keep it clean, but Philip was still lying on it, still pressing his full body weight onto that exact spot. And the wound couldn't heal, couldn't even stop growing, because the pressure never stopped. The blood flow never returned. The tissue never got the oxygen it needed. So the wound deepened. The dead tissue turned black. Necrotic. The physicians tried to clean it out, remove the dead tissue. It's called debriding. They would carefully cut away the black tissue, or sometimes apply substances meant to dissolve it. But underneath the dead tissue, more tissue was dying. The wound was growing, spreading outward, spreading downward, getting wider and deeper, simultaneously. Within a week, the ulcer was the size of a fist. Within 2 weeks, you could see muscle, red tissue at the bottom of the wound, white connective tissue around the edges, black necrotic tissue at the margins where the wound was still expanding. And pus, always pus, because the wound was infected. Of course it was infected. It was an open sore on a patient whose blood was already full of bacteria from the knee infection. The bacteria from Philip's knee had spread through his bloodstream. sepsis. Bacteria circulating through his entire body, settling wherever they found a foothold. And open wounds are perfect footholds. So the back ulcer became colonized, infected. Another source of pus, another abscess the physicians had to drain, another wound they couldn't close. By early August, the ulcer on Philip's back was massive. Court records describe it as the depth of a hand's width, 4 inches deep, maybe more. Exposing the vertebrae, you could see bone at the bottom of the wound, white, glistening, probably infected itself by this point. The physicians packed the wound with cloth soaked in wine or oil, tried to keep it clean, tried to control the infection, but they were fighting a losing battle. And more sores were appearing. On Philip's buttocks, where his pelvic bones pressed against the mattress. 2 sores, 1 on each side, growing just like the back ulcer, starting as red patches, progressing to blisters, breaking open, deepening, becoming infected, draining pus on his heels, where the bones pressed through thin skin. The physicians tried to keep these elevated, tried to cushion them, but Philip's leg couldn't stay elevated because of the knee infection, so the heels pressed into the mattress, and sores developed and deepened. On his shoulder blades, 2 more sores, smaller than the others but growing, infected, draining, on his elbows, from the way he tried to brace himself, tried to shift position using his arms. The pressure created sores, and those sores became infected, even on the back of his head, where his skull pressed against the pillow, a patch of thinning skin. Not a full ulcer yet, but heading that way. The physicians tried to pad it, but Philip's head had to rest on something, and wherever it rested, pressure built. Tissue died. By mid-August, Philip's body was covered in pressure ulcers. The physicians counted at least 8 major wounds, and dozens of smaller ones. His entire back was essentially one massive interconnected system of ulcers. The wounds had grown together, merged, created a single large area of necrotic tissue covering most of his lower back and buttocks. The sheets beneath Philip were constantly soaked with blood, with pus, with serous fluid, with the drainage from multiple infected wounds. They changed his bedding multiple times a day, would lift him carefully, agonizingly, while he screamed and begged them to be more careful, while servants stripped the old sheets and replaced them with fresh ones, and then lower him back down, and within hours the fresh sheets would be soaked again. The smell was overwhelming now, multiple infected wounds, all draining, all producing that distinctive, sweet, rotten smell of decomposition. The physicians burned incense constantly, multiple braziers in the room, frankincense and myrrh, the most expensive incenses, filling the room with smoke. They scattered herbs on the floor, lavender, rosemary, sage, anything with a strong scent. They hung pomanders, balls of ambergris or civet musk studded with cloves. They opened windows despite the heat, anything to mask the smell. Nothing worked. The smell cut through everything, dominated the room, seeped into the hallways, could be detected from 50 feet away. Visitors to the royal apartments would stop in the corridor, smell it, turn pale, ask if they could be excused. Even hardened soldiers, men who'd been on battlefields, who'd seen carnage, they'd smell Philip's death chamber and lose their composure. Servants started refusing to enter, or would enter only with vinegar-soaked cloths tied around their faces, breathing through their mouths, moving as quickly as possible, doing what needed to be done and fleeing. Some servants vomited, had to be replaced, couldn't handle it. Even the most loyal attendants needed breaks, needed to step outside, breathe fresh air, clear the smell from their lungs and nostrils. The monks who came to give Philip communion would rush through it, hold their breath, place the host on Philip's tongue as quickly as possible, and retreat. Some monks requested to be excused from this duty, said they couldn't handle it, that the smell made them physically ill, that they were afraid they'd vomit during the sacrament. The abbot refused, said the king needed spiritual comfort, that serving the king in his suffering was itself a form of prayer. So they went, suffered through it, and probably prayed more fervently after those visits than they ever had before. Philip's son stayed with him, Philip III, 20 years old, heir to the empire, completely unprepared for this. He would sit at his father's bedside for hours, holding that skeletal hand, trying not to breathe too deeply, trying not to show his revulsion, trying to be the dutiful son while his father rotted in front of him. Sometimes he'd have to leave, go outside, vomit, cry, then compose himself and go back in. Because his father expected him to be there, expected him to witness this, to learn from it. To understand that being king meant enduring things other people couldn't endure. And Philip himself, still conscious, still aware, he could smell his own body decomposing, could see the horror in people's eyes when they approached, could feel the tissue breaking down, the wounds deepening, the infection spreading. He understood exactly what was happening to him. He kept praying. His rosary was always in his hand, fingers wrapped around the beads, thumb moving from bead to bead, lips moving constantly. Prayers for strength, for endurance, for the ability to bear this suffering with faith. Because Philip believed this had meaning, that God was testing him, purifying him through suffering, making him holy through pain. But late at night, when the pain was worst, when he couldn't sleep, when his body was screaming and there was no relief, Philip would weep, quietly, trying not to let the servants hear, trying to maintain his dignity, but weeping nonetheless, because he was in agony, because his body was betraying him, because he was the king of the most powerful empire on earth, and none of that mattered. None of that could stop what was happening to him. The physicians were draining Philip's wounds constantly now, from the knee, still, but also from the back ulcers, from the buttock sores, from the shoulder wounds, from every abscess and pocket of infection. They would lance the necrotic tissue, let the pus drain into basins, clean the wounds with wine or oil, pack them with cloth, bandage them, and watch as they filled with pus again within hours. One physician documented the amount, more than a quart of pus per day, a litre of pus every day, for weeks. Where was it coming from? From Philip's body? From the infection consuming him from the inside. The bacteria were everywhere now, in his bloodstream, in every organ, multiplying faster than his immune system could kill them, producing toxins, breaking down tissue, turning solid flesh into liquid waste. And Philip's body was liquefying. Not a metaphor, literal liquefaction. The infection was consuming tissue, breaking down the structure, turning muscle and fat and connective tissue into fluid, into pus, into the discharge that the physicians drained 40 times a day. 40 times! That's not an exaggeration. That's from the medical records. 40 times per day. That's almost twice an hour during waking hours. Every hour, the physicians would lance infected tissue, drain pus, clean wounds, change dressings, and then start over. An endless cycle of drainage and packing and bandaging. An endless battle against an infection they couldn't stop. And through all of this, Philip kept working, or tried to. Documents were brought to his bedside. He would squint at them through pain-clouded eyes, try to focus, try to understand what he was reading, but it was getting harder. The pain was too distracting. The fever was affecting his concentration. He'd have to reread things multiple times, ask secretaries to explain things slowly, but he kept trying, because that was who Philip was, the paper king, the micromanager, the man who believed he personally had to approve everything. Even dying, especially dying, he couldn't stop, couldn't delegate, couldn't let go. So he kept reading, kept making decisions, kept signing his name with a hand that shook from pain and fever and exhaustion. His counselors begged him to rest, to conserve his strength, to focus on his soul instead of state business, but Philip refused. The empire didn't stop just because he was dying. Someone had to make the decisions. Someone had to stay in control, and that someone was him. Until the moment he physically couldn't do it anymore. That moment was coming, but it wasn't here yet. So Philip read and signed and dictated, while his body decomposed beneath him, while his flesh turned to pus, while his bones became exposed to air. He kept working, because stopping meant accepting defeat. And Philip II didn't accept defeat, not from rebels, not from Protestant heretics, and not from bacterial infection. He would fight until the end, until his heart finally stopped, until his lungs finally gave out, until death finally took mercy and finished the job. But until that moment, he was still Philip II, still the king, still the most powerful man in Europe, even if that power had been reduced to signing documents with a shaking hand while his body rotted around him. By late August, new symptoms appeared. Philip had been suffering for over 6 weeks now. The knee infection had spread through his bloodstream. The pressure ulcers had merged into massive wounds. His entire body was fighting systemic sepsis. And now, the infection was colonizing new areas, new organs, new systems. Everything was failing. Abscesses started appearing on Philip's abdomen, not from pressure, from the bacteria in his bloodstream. They were settling in tissue, forming new colonies, new pockets of infection. Philip would complain of new pain. The physicians would examine him, find a swelling, realize it was an abscess, lance it, drain it, add it to the list of wounds they had to manage. An abscess appeared on his chest, right side. The physicians drained it, thick pus, foul-smelling, infected. Another on his left arm, not at a pressure point, just bacteria colonizing tissue, forming an abscess, another wound to drain, another source of infection. The physicians were losing track. Too many wounds, too much drainage. They tried to document everything, to keep records, but it was overwhelming. Philip's entire body was becoming one massive, seeping infection. Everywhere they looked, new abscesses, new drainage, new necrosis. And Philip's fever was spiking, high fever, dangerous fever. His skin was hot to the touch, dry. His face was flushed. His eyes were beginning to look sunken, hollow, the flesh around them thinning. His cheeks were gaunt, skeletal. He was starving, literally starving, because he couldn't eat. The infection and the pain had destroyed his appetite. Food looked revolting, smelled revolting. He'd take a bite of bread, a sip of wine, and push it away. Nausea, disgust, couldn't force himself to swallow. His body was consuming itself. No food coming in. But the body needs energy, needs fuel. So it started breaking down its own tissue, muscle, fat, anything that could be converted to energy. Philip was wasting away, the flesh melting off his bones. His ribs were visible, his clavicles protruding, his arms thin, skeletal. He looked like a corpse that was still breathing, and his skin was changing colour. Yellow, jaundiced, his liver was failing. The infection had spread there, or maybe just the toxins from the infection were overwhelming the liver's ability to filter them. Either way, bilirubin was building up in Philip's blood, turning his skin yellow, turning his eyes yellow. The whites of his eyes looked like old parchment, yellowish, bloodshot, clouded. His urine was dark, almost brown. Another sign of liver failure, of kidneys struggling, of organs shutting down. The physicians noticed, documented it, knew what it meant. Philip's body was failing systemically now, not just the infection in his knee, not just the pressure ulcers, everything, every organ, every system, all of it breaking down simultaneously. And Philip's mind was starting to be affected. Not constantly. He'd still have lucid periods, still be able to understand what was happening, still try to work, but then he'd fade, become confused, not know where he was, not recognize people. The toxins in his blood were affecting his brain. Uremia, Kidney failure. The waste products that should have been filtered out were building up, poisoning him from the inside. He'd ask questions that didn't make sense, talk about people who weren't there, sometimes people who'd been dead for years. His father Charles, his son Don Carlos, his wives. He'd have conversations with them, answer questions no one else could hear, then suddenly snap back, realize where he was, who was around him, apologize for the confusion, try to focus. The physicians knew what this meant. The end was approaching. When a patient started losing mental clarity, when they started having conversations with the dead, when they stopped being able to distinguish reality from hallucination, that was a sign. The body was shutting down. The brain was being affected. Death was close, but Philip rallied, would have periods of clarity, hours where his mind was sharp, where he could think, could focus, and during those periods he'd call for his son, for his advisors, give instructions, make decisions, sign documents, try to finish everything that needed finishing, try to prepare the empire for his absence. He knew he was dying, understood it clearly during the lucid periods, accepted it, but he wanted to die having done his duty, having set things in order, having left clear instructions for his successor. So he pushed through the confusion, through the pain, through the fog in his mind, and worked until the confusion returned, until he faded again, until the toxins overwhelmed his ability to think, and his body kept rotting, the wounds kept draining, the pus kept flowing, the physicians kept lancing abscesses, keep packing wounds, keep changing dressings 40 times a day, every day, an endless cycle, an endless losing battle. The smell was unbearable now, beyond anything anyone had experienced, beyond what words could describe. The sweet rotten smell of necrotic tissue, the sharp smell of pus, the coppery smell of blood, the acrid smell of infection, all mixed together, all concentrated in one room with inadequate ventilation. In the heat of late August, people would approach Philip's bedroom door and gag, turn away, refuse to enter, even when ordered, even when threatened. They physically couldn't do it. The smell was overwhelming, overpowering. It would trigger immediate nausea, immediate vomiting. The body's defensive response: get away from this. This is death. This is decay. Run. But some people had to stay. The physicians, some loyal servants, Philip's son. They endured it, suffered through it, tied cloths around their faces, breathed through their mouths, tried not to think about it, tried to focus on their duty, on serving the king, on witnessing his suffering, on learning whatever lesson this horror was supposed to teach. And Philip himself was fully aware of the smell, knew it was coming from his body, from his decomposing flesh, from his infected wounds. He could smell himself, could smell his own rot, could understand that he was experiencing his own decomposition, that he was watching himself decay, that he was conscious during a process that should only happen after death. This was the horror. Not just the pain, not just the wounds, not just the infection, but the awareness, the full, lucid, undeniable awareness of what was happening. Philip wasn't delusional, wasn't in denial. He understood biology well enough, had read enough, had been educated enough. He knew what decomposition was, what necrosis was, what sepsis was. Maybe not in those exact terms, but he understood the concepts, and he was experiencing them, consciously, while still alive, while still thinking, while still praying and working and trying to maintain his dignity. That was the true nightmare, not death, but the conscious experience of decomposition, the knowledge that his flesh was rotting, that his body was being consumed, that he was dying in the slowest, most horrible way possible, and that there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The physicians tried everything, every treatment they knew, every technique they'd learned. They consulted texts, ancient medical writings, Galen, Avicenna, Hippocrates, looking for some method, some cure, something they'd missed. They tried different poultices, different herbs, different drainage techniques. They tried bloodletting from different sites, tried purges, tried enemas, tried anything that might restore the balance of humours, anything that might stop the infection. Nothing worked, everything failed. Because they were treating humoral imbalances. And Philip had bacterial sepsis, two completely different things. One a theory with no basis in reality, one a biological process they couldn't see or understand. There was no intersection, no point where their treatments could actually address the real problem. So Philip kept decomposing, kept rotting, kept draining pus, kept developing new abscesses, kept losing weight, kept getting weaker, kept fading, while his physicians worked tirelessly, desperately, trying to save him, trying to do something, anything, even though, deep down, they knew it was hopeless, knew they were just witnesses, just documenters, just servants attending a death they couldn't prevent. And Philip knew it too. In his lucid moments, he understood. This was how he would die, not suddenly, not peacefully, not with dignity, but slowly, horribly, consciously, rotting, for weeks, while everyone watched, while everyone smelled it, while everyone remembered. This would be his legacy, not the empire he'd built, not the wealth he'd accumulated, not the wars he'd won or the faith he'd defended, but this death, this horror, this demonstration that power meant nothing when your body failed, that wealth couldn't buy health, that faith didn't prevent suffering, that even the most powerful man on earth died like everyone else, badly, painfully, grotesquely. Philip accepted this, or tried to. He prayed for acceptance, for the strength to endure, for the faith to believe this suffering had meaning, that it wasn't random, that it was part of God's plan, that he would be judged worthy, that his suffering would purify him, that he would die in a state of grace. But acceptance didn't make it hurt less, didn't make the smell less overwhelming, didn't make the wounds less horrific, didn't make the decomposition less grotesque. It just meant Philip faced it without raging, without questioning God, without demanding to know why this was happening. He accepted, endured, suffered. Because that's what faith required. That's what being a Christian king meant. Accepting God's will, even when God's will looked like this. And we're still not at the end, still not at the final days, because Philip had more suffering ahead, more decline, more horror. The worst was yet to come, the moments when his body would completely betray him, when he'd lose the last vestiges of control, when death would hover close but refuse to finish the job, when 52 days of agony would finally, mercifully end. But not yet. We're only on day 40. 40 days of conscious decomposition. With 12 days still to go, 12 more days of suffering that would test Philip's faith. That would break witnesses' spirits. That would become legend. That would be told and retold for centuries as a cautionary tale about mortality and power and the fragility of flesh. Those final 12 days are coming. And they're worse than everything that came before. By early September, Philip had been dying for nearly 2 months. 50 days. 50 days of increasing agony. 50 days of conscious decomposition. And he was still alive, still breathing, still lucid for periods, still aware of everything happening to him. His heart kept beating. His lungs kept drawing breath. His body refused to die even though it was falling apart. The physicians were mystified. They'd seen infections before, seen people die from them, usually quickly. A few days, maybe a week. The body's systems would shut down. The person would slip into unconsciousness, then death, clean, relatively quick. But Philip wasn't following that pattern. He was lingering, suffering, remaining conscious, for weeks beyond what should have been possible. Part of it was his constitution. Philip had been healthy for most of his life, strong, vigorous despite the gout. His heart was good. His lungs were strong. His body had reserves, resources. Even under attack by overwhelming infection, his organs kept functioning. Not well, but enough. Enough to keep him alive, enough to prolong the suffering. Part of it might have been the opium. The physicians were giving him opium dissolved in wine. For the pain. It helped a little. Took the edge off. Made the suffering bearable enough that Philip could sleep occasionally. Could rest. And that rest might have helped his body. Might have given it enough respite to keep fighting. Keep surviving. Even though surviving meant more suffering. But mostly, it was just biology. Random biological variation. Some people's bodies shut down quickly. Others linger. Philip's body was a lingerer. His heart was stubborn. His lungs refused to give up. His brain kept firing, kept processing, kept keeping him conscious and aware and suffering. There was no medical reason, no explanation, just the cruel randomness of how different bodies respond to the dying process. By September 5th, Philip had developed seizures, brief ones. His body would go rigid, shake, his eyes would roll back, last for maybe 30 seconds, then stop. He'd come back. Confused, disoriented, asking what had happened. The physicians didn't know what caused them. Could have been the infection. Could have been electrolyte imbalances from the constant fluid loss. Could have been kidney failure. Could have been any number of things going catastrophically wrong in Philip's body. They started happening multiple times a day. Philip would be conscious, talking, praying, then suddenly seize. The servants would hold him down, try to keep him from hurting himself, try to make sure he didn't bite his tongue, wait for it to pass. Then Philip would come back, exhausted, more confused, more disoriented, less able to focus. His breathing changed, became laboured, rattling, the death rattle they call it. The sound of fluid accumulating in the lungs. Philip was drowning. Slowly, his lungs filling with fluid from the infection, from heart failure, from fluid shifts caused by his failing kidneys. Each breath was a struggle, a wet, gurgling sound. Horrific to hear, more horrific to experience. Philip would gasp, fight for air, panic. The servants would prop him up, try to help him breathe, but there was nothing they could do. The fluid was inside, in his lungs, in his airways, and it was building, up faster than his body could clear it. Each hour, his breathing got worse, more laboured, more desperate, and his circulation was failing. His extremities were cold, his fingers, his toes, his nose, cold and blue, cyanotic, not enough oxygen in his blood, not enough blood flow to the periphery. His body was shutting down from the outside in, conserving resources, trying to keep the vital organs functioning, sacrificing the extremities. His pulse was weak, thread. The physicians could barely feel it, had to press hard on his wrist, on his neck, to find the faint flutter of his heart, still beating, barely, weakly, irregularly. The heart was failing too, struggling, overwhelmed by the infection, by the toxins, by the demands being placed on it. Philip's urine output had stopped. His kidneys had failed completely. Waste was building up in his blood. Urea, creatinine, potassium, all of it toxic, all of it affecting his brain, his heart, his ability to think. He was being poisoned from the inside by his own body's waste products, by the bacteria's metabolic byproducts, by the breakdown of his own tissue. He was barely conscious now, drifting in and out, more out than in. When he was conscious, he was confused, disoriented, didn't recognize people, didn't know where he was, would try to speak, but the words didn't make sense, fragments, disconnected thoughts, prayers mixed with childhood memories, mixed with state business, all jumbled together. But sometimes, rarely, he'd have a moment of clarity. His eyes would focus, he'd recognize his son, would speak clearly, would give an instruction, make a final decision, and then fade again. Back into the confusion, back into the fog. Those moments of clarity became rarer, briefer, further apart. The monks were singing constantly now, continuous prayer, continuous hymns, the prayers for the dying. In manus tuas Domini, commendo spiritum meum. Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit, over and over. A continuous soundtrack to Philip's final days. The monks taking shifts, never stopping, never silent, just constant prayer, constant hymns, constant preparation for death. Philip's confessor stayed at his bedside almost continuously, offering prayers, offering absolution, giving Philip extreme unction, last rites, the sacrament for the dying, anointing him with holy oils, praying over him, preparing his soul for judgment. They gave him extreme unction multiple times, because he kept not dying, kept lingering. So they'd give it again, just to make sure, just to be certain his soul was prepared whenever the moment came. And Philip would respond, even in his confusion, even when he didn't seem conscious. The priest would begin the prayers, and Philip's lips would move, following along, mouthing the words he'd memorized decades ago, the prayers he'd said thousands of times, so ingrained they didn't require conscious thought. Just reflex, just muscle memory. His faith expressed through dying lips that could barely move. His family was gathered. Philip III at his bedside constantly now. Isabella Clara Eugenia had come from the Netherlands, rushed to Spain when she heard her father was dying. She arrived in early September, saw her father for the first time in years, saw him rotting, decomposing, barely alive, and she broke down, wept, couldn't believe this was the father she remembered, the strong king, the powerful ruler, reduced to this animated corpse, this breathing decay. Philip recognized her in one of his lucid moments, called her by name, told her he loved her, gave her a blessing, told her to be strong, to support her brother, to maintain the faith, and then faded again. Back into the confusion, back into the suffering. Isabella stayed, held his hand, wept quietly, prayed for his death, for his suffering to end, for God to show mercy and take him. The court was in vigil, everyone important, everyone who could be there, gathered in the rooms adjacent to Philip's bedroom, praying, waiting, preparing for the transition. The king was dying. The heir would soon be king. The empire would continue. But this moment, this passage from one reign to the next, was sacred, dangerous. Everyone needed to be present, to witness, to give legitimacy to the succession. And Philip lay in his bed, eyes mostly closed, breathing wetly, rattling, each breath a struggle, each moment uncertain. Would this breath be his last? Would this heartbeat be the final one? Would this be the moment death finally came? But it wasn't. The next breath came. The heart beat again. Philip lingered, suffered, continued. On September 10th, Philip seemed to rally, very slightly. His breathing eased a bit. His pulse strengthened. His eyes opened, focused. He looked around, saw the people gathered, his son, his daughter, his counselors, the priests, the physicians, everyone waiting, everyone watching, everyone preparing for his death. And Philip spoke, clearly, coherently, for the first time in days. He asked for communion. The priest brought it, placed the host on Philip's tongue. Philip swallowed, closed his eyes, prayed, then opened them again, looked at his son, at Philip III, who would soon be king. And Philip spoke one word, just one, barely audible, hoarse and broken. Good, that's all. That's everything he said. But everyone understood. He was saying goodbye, giving his blessing, accepting that his son would rule, that the empire would continue, that his work was done. The word encompassed everything he wanted to say, everything he didn't have the strength to say. All the advice, all the warnings, all the love, all condensed into one word. Good. It's good. You'll be good. It will be good. Everything is good. And then Philip turned his head, toward the window he'd designed 35 years ago, the window facing the basilica, the window through which he could see the altar, the tabernacle, the consecrated host. He fixed his eyes on that spot, on that view, on that image of divine presence, and he didn't look away again. The monks in the basilica were celebrating Mass, continuous Mass. They'd been doing this for weeks, but now they knew. The end was imminent. So they sang louder, prayed harder, called out to God, begged for mercy, for Philip's soul, for his suffering to end, for his passage to be peaceful, for his faith to be rewarded. Philip's breathing slowed, each breath coming further apart. Longer pauses between inhalations. His chest would rise, fall, then nothing. For long seconds, 10, 15, 20, everyone would think it was over, that he'd died, and then another breath, shallow, rattling, weak, but another breath. He was still there, still holding on, still not ready, still not released. His pulse became imperceptible. The physicians couldn't find it, would press on his neck, his wrist, feel nothing, think he'd died, and then find a faint flutter. Still beating, still fighting, his heart refusing to stop, refusing to give up, even though the rest of his body was gone, even though there was nothing left to fight for. The heart kept beating. His skin was grey, waxy, cold, the colour of death, but he was still breathing, still there, still conscious on some level. His eyes were open, fixed on that window, on that altar, seeing something no one else could see, or seeing nothing, just staring, just focused on that one point, that one image, that one thing he'd chosen to be his final view. The hours passed, night fell, the candles were lit, the monks kept singing, the family kept vigil, everyone waiting, everyone watching, everyone willing him to let go, to stop suffering, to die. But Philip held on, stubborn even in death, controlling even this, the timing, the manner, the final moment, refusing to go until he was ready, until he'd decided it was time. And at dawn on September 13th, 1598, 52 days after the infection began, Philip II of Spain died. His breathing simply stopped. No final gasp, no dramatic moment, just one breath and then no more. His chest was still. His heart stopped. His eyes remained open, fixed on that window, on that altar, on that final view. The monks sang the Te Deum, a hymn of thanksgiving, not celebrating his death, but thanking God that his suffering was over, that his soul was free, that the horror had ended. The priest prayed over the body, gave final absolution, made the sign of the cross, covered Philip's face with a cloth. Philip III collapsed, sobbed. He'd been king for less than a minute and the weight was already unbearable. He'd watched his father die for 52 days, watched him rot, watched him suffer, and now he had to be king, had to rule the same empire, had to carry the same burden. And he wasn't ready, wasn't capable, wasn't his father, but he was king now, ready or not. The servants began preparing the body, washing it, dressing it, trying to make it presentable for lying in state. But Philip's body was beyond presentable. The infections had destroyed it. The pressure ulcers, the abscesses, the necrotic tissue. They did their best, covered the worst wounds, dressed him in royal robes that would hide the decomposition. But everyone who saw the body knew what he'd endured, knew how he'd suffered. They moved him to the basilica quickly, within hours, partly because tradition demanded it. Royal funerals happened swiftly, but mostly because the body was still decomposing, still producing that smell, still rotting, even after death. They couldn't preserve it, couldn't slow the decay. They just had to get it buried before it got worse. The funeral was simple. Philip had requested this. No elaborate ceremony, no excessive mourning, just prayers, mass, the monks singing, and then burial in the royal crypt beneath the basilica, the crypt he'd designed, the final resting place he'd planned for decades. They placed his body in a temporary tomb first, Royal bodies were kept for several years before being moved to permanent resting places. This allowed the flesh to decompose completely, to leave only bones. Clean bones that could be moved without the horror of partial decomposition. So Philip's body was sealed in a lead casket, placed in a vault, and left to finish rotting in private. Years later, when they moved his remains to the permanent royal pantheon, the workers reported that the body had decomposed normally, completely. Just bones remaining, clean white bones, no sign of the infections that had ravaged him in life. No evidence of the pressure ulcers, no trace of the horror he'd endured. Just bones, like anyone else, like a peasant, like a beggar. Death had equalized him, reduced him to the same calcium structure that underlies all human flesh, and the empire continued. The sun still didn't set on Spanish territories, the treasure fleet still sailed, the bureaucracy still functioned. Philip III took the throne. He wasn't his father, wasn't capable of the micromanagement, wasn't obsessed with control. But the systems Philip II had built kept working. The empire continued, because Philip had built something bigger than himself, something that could survive even his horrific death. But what Philip had endured in those 52 days, that lived on in a different way, in the memories of everyone who'd witnessed it, in the trauma of the servants who'd smelled it, in the nightmares of the physicians who'd documented it, in the grief of the son who'd watched it. They couldn't forget, couldn't unsee it, couldn't stop remembering the smell, the sounds, the horror of watching the most powerful man in the world decompose, alive. The court was silent about it publicly. Philip had died a holy death, surrounded by priests, eyes on the sacrament. That was the official story. The suffering wasn't discussed, the horror wasn't acknowledged, because you couldn't admit that the king, God's anointed representative, had died in such an ungodly way. You couldn't say that his death had been grotesque, that his body had rotted, that he'd suffered more than anyone should suffer. You maintained the fiction, the dignity, the narrative of a peaceful, pious death. But privately, everyone knew. Everyone who'd been there, everyone who'd witnessed it. They knew that Philip II's death was something out of nightmare, something that should never happen to anyone, let alone a king. They knew that power meant nothing when bacteria invaded your bloodstream, that wealth couldn't buy antibiotics that hadn't been invented, that faith didn't prevent suffering. It just gave you a framework for enduring it. Philip II had ruled the largest empire in history, had controlled more territory and wealth than any European monarch before him, had been the most powerful man on earth, and he died screaming in pain while his flesh liquefied and drained into basins 40 times a day. That was the lesson. That was what those 52 days taught everyone who witnessed them. We are not special, not immortal, not protected. We're just flesh, just temporary, just biological machines that break down. And when they do, when the systems fail and the infections spread and the body starts to decompose, power doesn't matter, title doesn't matter, faith doesn't matter, not for preventing the suffering anyway. Nothing matters except the brutal biological reality of tissue death and bacterial colonization. Philip II died the way everyone dies who gets septic infection in an era without antibiotics, badly, slowly, consciously. The only difference was that he died in a room he'd designed, in a bed positioned perfectly, with his eyes on a view he'd chosen. He died where he'd planned to die, how he'd planned to die. He just never imagined it would take 52 days, never imagined the pain, never imagined the smell, never imagined the horror of watching his own flesh liquefy. But he got his holy death. He died watching Mass, eyes on the host, surrounded by prayer, exactly as he'd wanted. He just had to pay for it with almost 2 months of agony, almost 2 months of conscious decomposition, almost 2 months of suffering that tested every aspect of his faith, that made witnesses question everything they believed about God's mercy. And Philip endured it, accepted it, kept his eyes on that window, kept praying, kept working when he could, kept maintaining his dignity and his faith until the moment his heart finally stopped. He died like a king, or at least like a king who'd planned his death with obsessive attention to detail. He died where he'd wanted, how he'd wanted, looking at what he'd wanted to see. It just took 52 days. 52 days of horror. 52 days of suffering. 52 days of proving that flesh is just flesh, that bodies rot, that even the most powerful man on earth is just meat and bones and bacteria. Just temporary, just mortal, just human. Thanks for staying with me through that. If you made it this far, you've just experienced one of the most extensively documented royal deaths in history. Drop a comment. Had you heard about Philip II before? What moment hit you the hardest? The pressure ulcers? The 40 daily drainages? The fact that he kept working even while decomposing? And if you want more stories like this, more deep dives into the uncomfortable truths history tried to bury, more honest looks at what death really looked like before modern medicine, subscribe, hit that notification bell. Because there are hundreds of stories like Philip's, people who suffered in ways we can barely imagine. Deaths that reveal truths about power, about medicine, about what it meant to be human before antibiotics existed. Sleep well tonight, in your clean bed, in your world where a knee infection means a prescription, not 52 days of agony. And maybe take a moment to appreciate that you live in an age of miracles, where infections are cured, where pain is managed, where death, when it comes, is usually quick, usually peaceful, usually nothing like what Philip endured. He was just human, just flesh and blood wearing a crown. And when that flesh started to rot, the crown didn't help. The empire didn't help. The power didn't help. Nothing helped except the biological processes of decomposition running their course until his heart finally, mercifully, stopped. That's the lesson. That's what 52 days taught to everyone watching. We're all temporary, all vulnerable, all just flesh, and flesh always rots, eventually, even royal flesh, even the flesh of the most powerful man on earth. Good night.